Before we start, there's a correction I need to make regarding my Shenmue 1 review. Now, I recently rewatched it, and I've decided it's worth an 8.5 rather than what I originally gave it, being a 7.5. I just wanted to clear that up before this review started, and with that said, I hope you enjoy. For a game turning 20 years old this year, you'd be hard to find a community so dedicated all this time later. Sure, you have your Mario 64s, which are still talked about to some extent, but I don't think that even a game like that has a fan base that rivals that of the Shenmue series. To this day, you still have people passionate about this franchise, maintaining fan sites and YouTube accounts, creating self-published magazines and comics, and visiting the areas that these games are set in so much that Real Life Doughboy actually made a tourism map for English-speaking guests to use. 22 years ago, Yu Suzuki started his story not just about revenge, but ultimately the things that happened along the way as well. And then not even 2 years later, it got its groundbreaking sequel. My name is Neremik, and today we'll be taking a look at Shenmue II, what makes it so great, why it still stands the test of time 2 decades later, and ultimately what makes it so special. It's gonna get long. In fact, this is most likely going to be the longest review of Shenmue II on the site for a good while, so if the chances that you're still stuck waiting for the tattoo parlor to open in the first game, hopefully you'll have the time to watch this. Of course, spoilers are going to be inbound for this one, so if you want my honest opinion on the game without the spoilers, the timestamp should be in the comments, or you can also use the description bar or the playback bar to take you right there. And with that said and out of the way, chances are you're likely here to hear me sing this game's praises, so I won't keep you waiting.
He does not know of the strength hidden within him. The strength that would destroy him. The strength that would fulfill his wishes. When he is ready, he shall seek me out, and we shall brave together the rocky path. I shall wait. This encounter has been my destiny since ancient times. A dragon shall emerge from the earth, and dark clouds shall obscure the heavens. A phoenix shall descend from above. Its wings will create a purple wind. In the midst of the pitch-black night, a morning star shall glisten, alone.
Shenmue II originally released on the 6th of September 2001 for the SEGA Dreamcast, and then later for the original Xbox as part of an exclusivity deal in the USA. At this point, Sega was losing more money than you could dare to ever dream of. The original Shenmue sold nearly nowhere enough copies to remake its development costs, due to the fact not enough people actually owned the Dreamcast to play it. But unknown to the public at the time, there was one more ace up their sleeve. At the time, a Shenmue sequel was inevitable. Magazines had shown screenshots of the first game which had certain things in there which weren't quite used, and these were later to be proven to be part of the sequel. Taking the time they had to learn from the first game and the criticism it got, Yu Suzuki and his team set out to make Shenmue game the best game they possibly could with the time and money they had. It was a gamble that would either send the company into almost certain bankruptcy, or help them get on their feet, if only just a small bit. Now, the first game got praise across the board in its review scores, and the people wanted more. For most people, Shenmue wasn't just the first step of what was to come for the future of video games. It was a game they felt was truly fantastic. Undoubtedly, Shenmue II was at the time of its release the biggest game ever made. It was a pipe dream for any other developer to make a game which rivaled its scope for years to come, and of course, a game this big can't be almost perfect, right? Well, I picked the game up for Christmas 2018, let it sit for about a good 2 years now, and I'm not from the same era most people were when the game first came out. So there's bound to be some interesting observations mixed in here, and there's sure bound to be some flaws. But I'm here to tell you today, right here and now, that Shenmue II is almost a perfect game, albeit for a few noticeable flaws. This review is over 2 hours long, so all I ask is that you leave a like if you do end up enjoying this. It was not an easy feat to pull this thing off. But with that said, I hope you enjoy the video. As is tradition here, we're going to start with the story segment, but this time just because it's easily going to take up most time out of any of them here. As a quick recap for what happened in the first game, Ryo Hazuki comes home one day to see a car parked outside of his family home and the sign off the door being snapped. He rushes in, watches his dad get murdered by someone he'll come to know as Lan-Di. He steals a mirror which his dad had buried underneath the cherry tree and takes his leave. After asking around, he finds out that the guy who killed his dad is a leader of a large Chinese crime organization, the Qiyu Men, and that he's heading back off to mainland China. Before Ryo sets off on a boat to Hong Kong to chase him, a few other things happen like his girlfriend being kidnapped, but more importantly, he finds another mirror in the basement of the dojo. To be honest, that's pretty much where the story ends. Of course, there is a lot more stuff to it, but that's pretty much all the important story beats. I wish I could condense this game's plot as much. Shenmue II picks up where Shenmue 1 left off, with Ryo arriving in Hong Kong. His dad is still dead, he knows who did it, he wants revenge more than anything, and he's got some leads he's going to follow up on. He walks through the pier and is harassed by pretty much everyone there into trying to buy something, and eventually has a photo snapped of him which will come in handy later. While he actually doesn't prompt Ryo to buy the photo, he will try to do it later. At least that's what someone who was on the same boat as Ryo says. She also thanks him for trying to save her daughter on a boat, which is a reference to the manga panels which you can unlock in this game, which tell a short story about something that happened on said boat trip. Anyway, Ryo carries on, and before long we'll end up meeting the first of many new characters in this game, Joy. After a brief exchange resulting in him being told the location of a place he can stay at, he carries on, but before long runs into yet another new character called Wong. What initially looks to be some sort of mugging gone wrong turns out to be a mugging gone right, in the sense it was all a trap to steal Ryo's bag for whatever valuables were inside. This is where the formula you were used to in Shenmue 1 comes back into play. He'll ask a few locals, find out who Wong is and where he's meant to be hanging out at that time. In most cases, just head over to Pigeon Park, go through a quick QTE segment, which leads into the first fight of the game, where if you come out the winner, Wong will lead you to where your bag is stashed. All the money's gone, but lucky for Ryo, the Phoenix Mirror is still there, so it's all good. By this point, it's getting late in the day, so Ryo goes over to the come-over guest house. But that's when he realises that unlike the first game, he's going to need money to stay somewhere, so he asks around for the odd job, landing himself one at the Lucky Hit stand down the road. In the morning, Joy introduces him to the harbour where he can move crates for money as well. After his shift ends, the man who took his photo back at the harbour, as predicted, tries to sell him his photo again. But Joy being Joy turns up, doesn't really seem to care, and makes him take another photo with the two of them. She makes off on her bike without paying, leaving a very confused Ryo stood in the middle of Workers' Pier. Now that Ryo's first day in Hong Kong is mostly out of the way, he tries to follow up on the lead of Li Xiaotao, who was mentioned by Master Chen in the first game, and after following through on a few hints, he arrives at the I&II apartments where it appears they no longer live there. But the current resident reveals they've moved to somewhere starting with Man Mo in the Wise Men's Quarter. And after a quick trip to there, where almost everything is called a Manmo something, Ryo eventually gets told of a place called Manmo Temple. Arriving, he asks to speak with Tao, but he's told that he'll need to know something called the Four Wood in order to meet them. After following a breadcrumb trail leading him to a street performer, barber, and two elderly people located in the South Car main quarter, he knows all four. Of course, this being Shenmue, they all relate into martial arts in some way. To train every day, stay calm and make the right decision, don't use your moves thoughtlessly, and to act without hesitation and do what is right. After meeting with Tao and telling her the meaning of all four, she reveals that her name is actually Shu Ying, and she states that Ryo, while following two of the Wood, is missing the others. Offering him a place to stay at her house, free of charge, she says that she won't assist him in his quest for revenge, but hopes that by letting him stay with her and having him help around the temple, that he'll hopefully stop his quest for revenge and not fall onto what she believes is the path of evil. After all, martial arts are meant to protect lives, not end them after all. With that said, that wraps up Disc 1, and it's pretty much a quintessential Shenmue story. You go from A to B in the plot, and a few unexpected things happen along the way. If you want something that has the same feel as the beginning of the first game, this is your best bet. You have freedom in what you can do on this disc, whereas on the second, as you're soon to see later, it's severely cut down. As far as the actual story of this disc goes, I like it. The opening in Aberdeen by far leaves a huge impression, and ending on the note that Rio is still far than capable of taking down Landy is something I can respect. This disc isn't that long, however, and I'd argue it's a good thing more than anything, as disc 2 and 3 are the real main course of the game. And while I like the idea of the wood and what they mean, that portion of the gameplay where you collect them can be pretty tedious, as it falls into pretty much a formula for each one. Now buckle in, because from this point on, the discs start getting long. So disc 2 starts with Rio airing out books at Manmo Temple, and he'll continue to do this every single morning starting now. Continuing on his search for Yuandazu, he asks around, eventually finding out that he wrote a book called The Wulin Shu. Ask at a few bookstores, and eventually it turns out there's a copy nowhere else other than Manmo Temple, the same place Rio was airing books out just the hour before. Running back there, it's noticeable that where it's kept requires a key, and leaving to ask around for where it is, he runs into Zhuying, who says that if he wants the book, he'll need to calm his mind first. Walking over to the nearby tree, she says that if he can catch 3 leaves in a row and clear his mind while doing so, she'll give him the key. And with some trial and error later, Rio manages to pull it off pretty easily, and true to her word, Zhuying gives him the key. Inside the book, Rio flicks through the pages, trying to find what information he can. Eventually, on one page, he comes across what looks like a family tree, but one name sticks out more than anything: Su Ming Zhao, the man that Landy mentioned that Rio's dad had killed at the beginning of the first game. And just after he realises that, a piece of paper slips out from another page with Zhu's name stamps on it. And with that, Rio has his next lead. Heading into the Wise Men's Quarter and asking around at the antique shops, Rio finds that the piece of paper is known as a Chawan sign, and is used among martial artists to identify with each other. Visiting Gui Zhang, one of the people who had taught Rio the Wood, he learns that in order to properly set it up, he'll need to visit populated areas and arrange cups as seen on the piece of paper. If he's lucky, someone should realise it and drop him a note with information of where they can meet in private. Of course, this takes a while to explain, so by the time he's finished talking with them, it's getting late, so he heads back to Zhu Ying's apartment. Here he finds her sat at a desk, looking upset over a photo of her and someone else when they were much younger. The next morning, he asks her cleaner, I think, Fang Mei, if she knows who the other person in the photo is, and they say that all they know is that he's Xu Ying's brother, and that one day he vanished without a trace. Leaving the apartment, Rio tries to follow up on his Chawan sign lead. After his initial attempt goes wrong, leading to him being ambushed by people who are also looking for Zhu, he's eventually told to meet someone at the Dojang Diner later that day. Just as they're getting started, and it doesn't seem to be going wrong, the same people who jumped Rio the first time show up and take Zhu's associate. After a quick battle, an insanely cool QuickTime event sequence, and a little help from Zhu Ying from the sidelines, the associate, named Zhang, is rescued. Back at the trashed diner, it's revealed that Zhang actually has no idea where Zhu is, but he knows that the gang of the Yellowheads, ran by Dong Yu, are the ones who are trying to take him. However, with that said, he directs Rio to the Heavens gang, ran by a man called Ren. He knows he has a rivalry with the Yellowheads, but he states it's likely going to be a dangerous lead to pursue, but one that most likely will yield results. The next morning, Rio returns the Wulin Shu to Manmo Temple. While he's there, he runs into Zhu Ying again, where he tells her about the lead he has on Ren. She responds saying that he's needlessly risking his life by going down this path, and once again iterates that martial arts are used to protect people's lives, and that if he still decides to use his fists, that he's going to walk on the path of evil he's trying to stop. Rio says that he can't do that, and says that he doesn't want to give her any more trouble than he already has, and takes his leave, meaning that now he will need to find a new place to stay. However, of course, within minutes of him leaving the temple, Joy runs into him on her motorcycle and tells him to go back staying at the guest house immediately, because she's annoyed that he hasn't been staying at where she suggested. Of course, Rio does just that, and asking around he ends back up in Aberdeen. It turns out the gang who originally stole his bag at the start of Disc 1 are the same people he's been looking for. After heading to the harbour and looking into different gambling clubs, he eventually runs into some members of the Heavens who agree to take him to Ren. Of course, this is Shenmue, so Rio gets ambushed once they head into the wharf, and for the first time since Chai in the arcade, Rio actually loses a fight. When he wakes up, he's out on the water with Wong. He rests up for a few hours and is given a lighter by him so he can come and go from the wharf as he pleases. Of course, the entire gang know he isn't actually a member, so he does still get attacked by the odd gang member, though he actually does win these fights. After some light investigative work, he's told to go see Cool Z, one of the people who mugged Rio at the start of the game, if he wants to know where Ren is. Showing up at a trash lot, he's told that Ren only meets people who make quote-unquote donations of 500 Hong Kong dollars or more. Either after bullying a caveman for money, lifting crates, playing lucky hits, or beating up the cashier from the convenience store so he can bet on some duck races, he eventually has enough money. Returning to Cool Z, he agrees to give him the money, but on the condition he gives it in person. Agreeing with that, he takes Rio to Ren's warehouse. Once he's there, he gives Ren the money under the condition that he'll take him to Zoo, and there's a quick time event. Now the story branches for a brief moment here. If you fail like I did, you'll be beaten up and sent back to one's ship with Ren running off. This is the outcome most people get because it's pretty sudden and complex. However, if you succeed, Ren takes you to where Zoo is. Or so you think. Going into an underground warehouse, the person in charge of the duck racing scheme seems to be giving his earnings to someone who tried to take Zhang back at the diner. The lights all of a sudden go out and Ren steals the money left on the table, leaving Rio to deal with two very angry henchmen. Finish the battle and the mysterious person in red leaves the room. This is where the two paths come together. Either when Rio leaves the warehouse or the wharf, he'll be met by Joy and Wong. Rio is rightfully annoyed in both scenarios, and after being told that Ren is currently in Pigeon Park, he shows up. But Ren, being Ren, runs off, but Rio isn't far behind. Following him into a construction site, there's a series of quick-time events as Ren tries to slow Rio down up the scaffolding. Reaching the roof, Ren tries to make a jump to make his escape, but Rio is able to tackle him, causing the two to fall onto a truck below them. This knocks a dragon mirror out from Rio's pocket, and after seeing it, Ren says that he thinks there's money in whatever Rio's chasing. With that, he actually agrees to help him now. He starts by saying that Yuanda Zoo is no longer in Aberdeen or Wan Chai, but instead is hiding in the Kowloon walled city from the Yellowhead gang. With that said, the next day Rio has to say goodbye to everyone he met in the area. Say goodbye to Wong, the cashier you beat up, the people who taught you the wood, and last but certainly not least, Xu Ying. Saying goodbye at Manmo Temple, she tests Rio on the wood one more time, and decides that she'll teach Rio a new move, the counter elbow assault, before wishing him well on his journey. It's here why we find out why Xu Ying feels so strongly about Rio not taking revenge, as in a flashback we see that once she had a brother, the same one in the photo, much like Rio, he one day left on a quest to avenge their parents' death. In his quest, he ended up being lost to the evil path and was never seen again. With that, Rio will leave the temple one last time and be given a photo of the temple staff by Fangmei. And with that, Disc 2 finally comes to a close. At least for the main story, because this game has a side story you can do here. In a very short essence, Xu Ying has someone who helps out at her apartment in the temple named Fangmei. If you interact with her and her friend Eileen on a series of occasions, you'll find out she has a birthday coming up. Carry on and it will end with a wholesome little cutscene of Rio giving her a gift on her birthday. It's pretty easy to activate, but it's really easy to miss as well, so I suggest you at least give it a little look, because I've never personally activated this, and I can't really do it much justice because of that. Now, it's no surprise that this disc is a lot more packed with content than the first. I'll use myself as an example. My Let's Play in Disc 1 took about 4 episodes to complete, Disc 2 took double that. Now, obviously, this is where the story picks up, from finding a message in the Wulin Shoe to meeting someone that actually works with the zoo. Each story point feels like a significant step closer to finding out the truth about the murder that took place all those months ago. There's just one problem, and you would have heard me mention it at the beginning of this section. Airing out the books. Now, in all fairness, it's good QTE practice, but it suffers the same problem that the forklift did in the first game. Single music track, forced into it, drags on a little too long, but surprisingly that isn't my biggest problem. The big thing wrong with this is that it breaks up the story. See, a lot of the time in Disc 2 you'll wait around for an event to occur, and normally that will spill over into the next day. And as long as you're staying with Zhu, you are airing out these books for about 5 to 10 minutes every single time. And I cannot express this enough, whenever a new day ticks over, the story just gets put on hold for that duration of time. Which sucks. It well and truly does. Because despite that, the disc is really good. It's full of good and interesting things, there's a little bit of mystery getting started, and it builds really well to Disc 3. But any time that it hits 11:30, you damn well know that the next time Ryo wakes up, he's back at the temple doing the same task he's done for multiple days before. It's not an offensive piece of gameplay, it's just annoying because whenever you think the story's picking up on one specific day, it just comes to a halt the very next time you wake up. If you thought the Disc 2 section was long, you haven't seen anything yet. Disc 3 starts with Ryo arriving in Kowloon walled city on a bus, despite the fact the wall was already demolished at this time. From the offset, this is the polar opposite to what the last areas of the game were. Instead of feeling large, Kowloon feels suffocatingly large and small at the same time. After going through the gate into the city and being led to one of Ren's hideouts on the Dragon Street, him and Ren set off into the Thousand White Quarters to speak with someone who supposedly knows where Zhu is holed up. Going into the Great View building, they speak with the guy who seems to own a herb and medicine shop, suitably named Great View Herbs, who agrees to give them Zhu's whereabouts. They're told to look for men in black suits in the Dancing Dragon building, a nice nod to the first game's intro, and eventually they're led up to a room on the top few floors. Inside isn't Zhu, but instead Dou-Yu, the leader of the Yellowhead gang. He says he's looking for Zhu too and puts Ryo in a headlock. Just as all hope seems lost, Ren busts in with one of his usual quips, but in the end both of them are overwhelmed and locked up by the gang members. The two are handcuffed and thrown into a cell on the 5th floor, a less than ideal situation for Ren, who only showed up because he thought he'd make some easy money. About 3 days later, the two managed to escape after tricking the guards into opening the door for just a second. After that, since they're still handcuffed together, they use a lot of coordination and hiding in empty rooms around the building to evade the gang members, to eventually come to some emergency stairs in one of the rooms they hide in, which leads to them calling it a night as they sleep on the roof. The next morning, the duo try to take an elevator down to the ground floor, but are instead met with Yuan instead. This is the person who you saw on Disc 2 a couple times. After another QTE segment, they manage to disarm her just as Dou-Yu arrives as well. Running to the emergency exit, the two have no choice but to jump to the opposite building's roof, something for one reason or another Dou-Yu doesn't seem too keen on doing. Clearly displeased about being backstabbed by the guy at the shop, Ren and Ryo pay him a visit again. After some advanced interrogation techniques, he gives up that the wiretapper named Huang might know where he is. After simply breaking into his apartment, Ryo finds a bin bag full of tapes and starts to listen through them back at the hideout. With every other tape being a bust, on the last tape he finally manages to get some worthwhile info relating to Zhu. Although I feel it's important to mention that if you stick around and listen to the other memos on here, there's some absolute gems. There's a news report about Ryo and Ren tying up the man from Great View Herbs and how they've been involved with a few other cases of Wanchai and Aberdeen. There's also a conversation between Joy and Gui Zhang from the first game and a few others, and they're really nice touches. Of course, as mentioned before, on the tape there's also a call between Dou-Yu and Yuan, where it's revealed that she's managed to catch one of Zhu's men and is trying to get his whereabouts out of him. As the phone call comes to a close, a bell can be heard in the background, and as Ryo sets off to try and find where this is, a street performer asks Ryo to listen for just one song. Once he's done, Ryo asks him if he knows of anywhere a bell can be heard in the city, and he's told that the orphanage is a good place to start, and so that's where he sets off to. Meeting up with Ren there and bribing a child into giving up some information, it turns out Yuan has a talking bird, and so after asking around at a few bird shops, it turns out only one shop sells talking birds in all of Kowloon, and that's on the roof of the Three Birds building. Going up there, it turns out that Yuan stops pretty frequently there to buy some more bird food, so after hanging around for a few hours, Ren shows right up before Yuan does. The two then proceed to spend the late hours of the day following Yuan home as she berates shop owners all around the city and stops for a quick tea break. There's a few close calls, but ultimately the duo find themselves outside of her apartment. After a quick round of head or tails to decide who goes in, Ryo barges down through the door and knocks out Yuan. They manage to find Zoo's associate behind a partition, but before they have the chance to leave, they can hear Donyu approaching. Ren tells the parrot in its cage to repeat the phrase "hide in the wardrobe," whilst Ryo finds somewhere else to hide and the associate pretends to be unconscious. Once everything is in place, Donyu barges in and, just as expected, the parrot repeats what Ren said as he comes in. As he opens the wardrobe expecting to find Ren and co, the two manage to push him inside, lock him in, and escort the associate out while he bangs on the door. Back at the hideout, he hands Ryo a snake-looking key and says that Zoo is on the 10th floor of the Ghost Hall building. Joy stays behind to take care of him, whilst Ryo wastes no time in heading straight there. It's not so easy though. Much like the rest of the city, this building is fairly run down. Most noticeably, there's a massive hole through the middle of it. Taking the stairs, Ryo runs into a cage which blocks his access, and it's there he realises that the only way up is to balance on thin wooden beams to get to the other side. It's a far way down too, and if he falls it's most likely game over for him. He manages to do this though, until he reaches the top floor, and at the top is just a single, well-decorated door. And Ren! It turns out Ren just happened to follow some of the leads of his own and got a key for the elevator and stairs, leaving Ryo to heavily reconsider why he even bothered almost falling to his death for the past few minutes. Heading into the 5 Stars Corp, it's full of the same type of goods that were in Chen's warehouse from the first game, but Zoo is nowhere to be found. That doesn't deter the duo though, who insist there must be something hidden in the room. Looking in pots, drawers and behind banners, Ryo eventually finds a set of keys and a statue of Buddha that has holes in its face. He also finds a box with clothing he assumes was his father's as the family name is written on it. Things finally feel as though they're falling into place, and putting the keys he found in the Buddha statue, the wall slides to the side, revealing a hidden room. And who else is inside but Yuan the Zoo? Ryo immediately introduces himself, which prompts Zoo to ask if he's Iwao, his father's son, but before they can get any further, someone can be heard shouting that they found Zoo. In strolls Yuan, who's looking increasingly smug by the second, followed by Donyu. This prompts Ren to jump out the window, whilst Ryo is thrown out by Donyu. Landing on a rooftop, Ryo fights members of the Yellowhead before the leader himself jumps out. Ryo puts up a good fight, but is eventually brought to his knees. As he blacks out, no one else other than Zhuying steps in and fends Donyu off so that she can take Ryo and escape. That marks the second time that Ryo's lost a fight, and he doesn't wake up for 3 days while he's healing. When he does, he's in the Thousand White Covenant, and he sees Zhuying in the room with him. She explains that Zoo was taken somewhere by the Yellowhead gang, and that where he is now is where she and her brother grew up all those years ago. She tells Ryo the same thing we saw in the flashback at the end of Disc 2, that her brother left seeking revenge and was ultimately lost to the evil path. She asks Ryo once again to not follow the same fate, but he says that despite that, he still has to go and save Zoo to get his answers. Leaving the room, Wong is waiting for him outside and says that Ren is waiting for him back at the hideout. Just as they finish catching Zhang up on what took place, Joy busts in saying that she found out where Zoo is. It turns out he was taken to none other than the Yellowhead building, the hideout of the Yellowhead gang. Zhang says that they were most likely ordered by the Chi-Yu men, the gang that Lan Di is a part of, to find Zoo. Putting the pieces together isn't hard. The group realises that he was taken there for one reason alone: to turn him over to Lan Di. Ren points out that since the building is Donyu's territory, it won't be easy for them to get in and will most likely be extremely risky, which is something Ren can't get down with. Ryo says that even if he's out, he'll go it alone, causing both Joy and Wong to point out he'd be just going there to get killed. Despite that, Zhang says he'll try to get any information on them that he can, and he'll contact him again using the Charwan sign. Heading back into the city, Ryo tries to get access to the building Zoo's in, but all entrances are blocked by guards. At the final entrance, he meets Ren, who says that he changed his mind, thinking that Zoo will be profitable enough after all. He tells Ryo to look around the tea shops for information, and, taking the hint, Ryo sits down, makes the sign, and is soon handed a piece of paper pointing him to room 503 in the Moonchild building. Arriving at what is an entirely dark room, the person inside asks Ryo to spar with him before anything else. Of course, being entirely in the dark, Ryo has a hard time trying to get any hits in, and before long he stops by the man inside, who tells him to not rely on sight, but instead see things with his mind's eye. Side note, I have no idea what this scene means, but anyway. Managing to predict his opponent's move, he's told that this technique is called Predictive Explosion, which the UI tells us that Ryo masters almost instantly. Once that confusing thing is over and done with, he turns the light on to reveal that the mysterious man is the same one who gave him the hint about the bell earlier. It's then that he reveals that about 20 years ago, Ryo's dad visited Kowloon, and shortly comes to learn of how he was killed. He asks if there's anything he can do for him, and Ryo says that if he knew of a way to get into the Yellowhead building, he'd appreciate it. It's then revealed that there is a way inside, and he hands him a picture of a scout for the gang. He says that he typically hangs around the local street fighting rings, and that if he's able to impress him enough, he might recruit him and let him inside. Following through on that, Ryo goes on to beat the likes of Mongolian wrestlers, masters of various styles of martial arts, and catching a man who specialises in being hard not to catch. He's eventually approached by the scout who tells him to come to Dragon Street at sundown. Leading him to a secluded area, he gives him photos of 3 more fighters and says that if he's able to defeat them, then they'll talk about letting him into the gang. Of course it's not that easy. Each of these areas require you to pay to enter, ranging from 500 to 2,000 Hong Kong dollars. Spending some spare time to scrape together the smallest amount he can doing various tasks, he fights his first opponent, Rod Stunt. Each of these matches, rather than being one and done, are now best of 3 as well. Fighting in the basement of a building destroyed similar amounts to the Ghost Hall, this fight is cut relatively dry. He's tough, but Ryo still manages to come out on top and crush his cocky attitude, if only but a small bit. Up next is Chunyan, and upon arriving, Ryo catches the tail end of a match, where the losing party is thrown down a very deep pit, presumably to his death. Obviously, Ryo doesn't like the look of that, but he knows that if he's going to pursue Zoo, he has to win this fight. Either way, if he doesn't win, it's all over. Stepping into the ring, she puts up more of a fight than his last opponent, and eventually gets flipped by Ryo, leaving her dangling over the edge. Of course, Ryo is the better person and pulls her back up to safety, takes his winnings, and leaves without another word. If the notebook is anything to go by, the chances of her doing anything as cruel as she had before are slim. Finally, there's Greg Moore, who he fights in destroyed ruins on the outside of the main city. Ren is also there, and he actually seems ready to step in the ring, until he throws Ryo in at the last second and then quickly places a bet. This fight is different. If you get knocked out or knocked out of the ring, you lose the round. Despite being the hardest opponent yet, Ryo still manages to come out on top. However, Ren isn't such a great mood despite the victory. He says that he lost money because he won, and walks away annoyed. With that done, the scout, who'd been at all 3 of the fights, tells Ryo to meet him at Dragon Street once again. He tells Ryo to meet him the day after tomorrow in the Thousand White Building's basement. Back at the hideout, it's revealed, at least to their knowledge, that there isn't a basement in the Thousand White Building, implying that it must be a secret passage to the Yellowhead building. Ryo spends the next day going around Kowloon visiting all the places he'd been meaning to, and before long the night comes and the day he's meant to be taken to the Yellowhead building is here. Moving through the Thousand White building, he shows up at the meeting point, which appears to be but a hollowed out area, and he waits until the scout shows up. He gets directed down the hall to meet with the executives, but just as he sets off, Ren shows up and knocks the scout out. Going on to try and find a way in, they go ahead and end up at a gate, which is when Wong shows up, gives Ryo a map of the building, and lockpicks the gate open, and tells them that Zhu has been taken to the 17th floor, before heading back to the hideout. Going up the floors, they're initially undetected, taking out guards relatively silently, one at a time. They eventually reach a break room, take out the guys inside, and steal a transceiver so they can hear what moves the gang are making. Eventually, they have to start sneaking around, timing when the lights blink with when they run. A few floors later, they end up being unable to advance, as the floor gets filled with enemies whilst they sneak around. Luckily for them, someone finds the guards they've taken out and tells everyone to go up to the 8th floor, which is above them. Playing it smart, they find some stairs that go straight from the 7th to the 9th floor, but as they do, someone shouts that they saw them go up, and so they have to run away from the horde of goons, knocking down parts of the building to slow them down. It's not all fun and games though, because much like the Ghost Hall building, some of the higher floors need to be crossed by wooden planks. Things go fine until they hear Dou approaching, prompting them to quickly cross one of the beams and then knock it down so he can't follow them. They're not out of the woods just yet, as less than a minute later, no one else than Yuan walks out of a room holding nothing less than a chainsaw. In probably the coolest QTE sequence in the game, the two just barely manage to evade her, if not for long. Things don't let up, however, as Dou makes yet another appearance for a QTE, but is quickly defeated after he ends up falling through a hole in the floor. Almost at the 17th floor, the building is on high alert, and Yuan makes one more attempt at taking the duo out with her chainsaw. They pull out all of the stops they can to make sure that she doesn't chase them again, mainly by throwing dirty boxes and spraying a fire extinguisher at her. But Yuan, being clinically insane, shows up one last time on the 17th floor to have a chainsaw versus pipe match with Ryo. Finally disarming her, Ryo beats her in hand-to-hand combat as Ren handcuffs her to the elevator railing. Now, she hates filthy stuff, so Ren threatens her with a bin in order to get Zhu's location. It turns out he's been taken to the highest floor in the building, which, luckily for them, is accessible by elevator from this floor. They just have to get the key from the watchman's room on the floor above, and they can ride all the way up there. Appreciative for the information, Ren pushes the button to send down the elevator, but not before kicking the previously mentioned bin straight at her, causing her to scream all the way down. Of course, them having to spend so much time on a single floor leads to them running into some goons, and so that prompts Ren to stay behind to deal with them, whilst he gives Ryo the transceiver and tells him to go it alone. Going up, he's told by Ren that one of the goons he beat up talked, and that in 6 minutes the people on that floor are going to do their rounds. Checking every room, he eventually gets into a 4-man brawl in the watchman's room, and then leaves with the keys to operate the elevators. Because of the way each elevator works, he'll need to go down to basement level 3 in order to board the lift that takes him up to floor 40. When he gets there, however, he finds himself at yet another fighting ring, this one in a cage. He goes down some stairs and finds Joy of all people tied up, surrounded by guards. The fighter in the cage approaches Ryo and says that if he can beat him in a fight, he'll let him and Joy go. Being extremely talented, he's a tough one for Ryo to take down. After he thinks he's taken him down for the first time, he gets back up, practically with all of his health regenerated. Ryo, being worn down, still somehow manages to come out on top again, but much to his surprise, he has one last ditch effort to try and beat Ryo, but is ultimately defeated for a third time. With that, he asks for Ryo's name, and he says that he'll remember it, and with that, Ryo and Joy take their leave to the 40th floor. When they're in the elevator, it's revealed that Joy and Wong got worried, and both came to try and back up Ryo and Ren, but ended up being caught. She reveals that Wong was taken to the 40th floor, just as the doors open on the exact same floor. When they step out though, it's clear that the inside of this floor is different to the rest. Rather than the rundown interiors of the ones below, this floor is ornately decorated and has large paintings and sculptures of Dou and Yuan. Ren checks in over the transceiver, saying he'll be there shortly, and Ryo disposes of the Yellowhead's elite guard, who are guarding the way onto the roof. Joy stays behind to wait for Ren as Ryo finishes off the last people who are standing in his way. When he gets up top, he sees Zu being taken to the edge and knocked out by one of the suits. And just as he starts to run over to take him back, a helicopter shows up. And who else is dangling down from its ladder other than Lan Di? Joy and Ren rush up the stairs, and just as they go to make their move, Dong-Yu reveals himself to have Wong by the collar, holding him over the edge of the skyscraper. He boasts about how if he hands over Zu, he'll be able to serve the Chi-Yu men and rule over the entire city. Taking the chance, Wong bites the arm that he's being held with, causing him to be flung towards Ryo, who manages to catch him. While that happens, Ren knocks out the suit trying to hand over Zu, and Joy leads him towards the stairs back down. The helicopter pulls away from the building, leaving just Dong-Yu to take care of on the roof. It all comes down to this. If Ryo loses, almost everyone he's come to know through the story is dead. But if he wins, he can continue his quest to avenge his father's death. Ren moves to the stairs and holds off the backup that starts arriving, leaving just Ryo and Dong-Yu to fight it out. A remix of the first game's battle theme starts playing as they duke it out, and it's not easy. Ryo had already lost to Dong-Yu once after all, and it's clear his moves have a lot more power behind them. There's a lot of dodging involved to make sure he can stay in the fight, but little by little, he's able to whittle down the leader of the Yellowhead. Charging at him in a last-ditch effort, Ryo is left with no time to counter other than dodge. Things are looking bad, but that's when Ryo remembers the advice Zhu gave him about always having a clear mind, like a polished mirror. Just as it seems as though Dong-Yu's next move is the one to end the fight, and with the support of everyone who's there with him, Ryo counters him with the counter elbow assault, bringing an end to Dong-Yu once and for all. With that done, and Zu clearly not being handed over, Lan Di's helicopter begins to fly away. He and Ryo exchange a brief glance in silence, which says more than words ever could, and Ryo, backed up by Ren, who says he isn't giving up, returns back down the building and to the hideout. It's there that him and Zu finally have their long overdue conversation, where it's revealed that Lan Di killed Ryo's dad because he believed that Ryo's dad killed Zu Mingzell, his father. While Zu doesn't know what actually transpired, he knows that he did take Zhao's mirrors to Japan. Handing Zu the Phoenix mirror, he reveals that when paired with the Dragon mirror, the two form a key. Much to Ren's joy, that key is the treasure to what is supposedly believed to revive the Qing dynasty. Flicking the lights, grabbing a candle and blowing smoke into the air, the mirror illuminates 7 lights which are meant to be used to show the treasure's location. While they're not useful on their own, when paired with the lights from the Dragon mirror, it should reveal the treasure's location. Zu tells Ryo to head to Bailu village in Guilin, as the mirrors are made out of Phantom River stone which can only be found in that area. He supposes that Lan Di is also headed there as well, and with that said, Ryo sets off to the gates of Kowloon to take his leave. Joy and Wong chase after him, and Ryo thanks them for their help. As a parting gift, Wong hands Ryo 2 coins from Ren, which are revealed to have the same face on both sides, Joy stating that he managed to get Ryo one last time. They say their goodbyes and wish him well, and as Ryo turns to leave, they lament about how he always seems to take off without even properly saying goodbye. Back at the hideout, Ren gives the whole situation some thought and throws a knife at Guilin on the map, stating that things are getting interesting. Later that night, Ryo arrives back at Scarlet Hills and watches Zhu practicing in the courtyard of Manmo Temple. He asks her about one of the moves she performed just then, and one of the temple's assistants hands him a move scroll that describes its usage. He tells her about his plans to head to Guilin, and she gives him a good luck token, being the white half of a yin-yang. In a flashback, it's revealed that she and her brother found them when they were young, with him taking the black half and her taking the other. She says that she doesn't want to see him follow the same path as her brother, and she hopes that a gift is a reminder to stay on the right path. Ryo says he knows how her brother must have felt when he left, and that she most likely still does too. He promises that he won't die at the very least, and leaves, saying that her brother has to be alive somewhere as well. With that, he leaves Scarlet Hills for the last time and heads for Guilin. Disc 3 is Shenmue in its purest form. Everything up until this point led to that confrontation on the roof. That's the first time Ryo has actually seen Lan Di since the opening minutes of the first game, and I can't state just how much of an oh shit moment that was on a first playthrough. Those looks that they exchange as he flies away gives me chills every time I watch it, and with the things that get built on with his character thanks to Zu, the story finally feels like it's not just a quest for revenge anymore. It's clear as day that Ryo is improving as a fighter, and from the breadcrumbs left by the indication that there's a treasure at the end of this, it's a major turning point that is executed flawlessly. Of course, everything else that isn't the last 10 minutes is great as well. The fight with Chunyan, following Yuan, the interactions with Ren, and the moment when they first find Zu are all great in their own right. What started with Ryo being alone in Hong Kong ends with a group of people I think we can safely say are his friends. Something about seeing these guys all actually looking out for one another at the end, even if Ryo is persistent in trying his hardest not to show it, is really heartwarming. I'd argue Disc 3 is peak Shenmue as a whole. Everything comes together naturally to make something special. There are highs which get beaten time and time again, and the addition of some more humour, usually thanks to Ren, is a really welcome addition. Honestly, if the game ended here, it would have been fine. I would have been satisfied with the story we got. But Yu Suzuki disagreed. Shenmue II has one final story section on its 4th disc. Before we start, Disc 4 couldn't top the end of Disc 3, and the team knew that. Rather than try and top it, it goes in such a different direction you'd almost think it was a different game. Disc 4 really only has 5 short story points. The first is Ryo showing up to Guilin on a boat. He then walks for a little bit, and in a storm he rescues someone called Shenhua from drowning, who turns out to be from Bailu village. The two walk through the forest towards there, with Ryo asking her about Guilin and her asking him about Japan. The two eventually decide to sleep in a cave for the night, where Ryo shows off pictures of people he cares for after gathering some firewood. The next day, the two arrive at Shenhua's house to find her father missing, presumably off working in a stone pit. While there, Ryo asks the name of the tree outside, and this is when we find out what, at least in the game world, Shenmue is. Shenmue is that tree, and Shenhua is named after the flower that blooms on it. It's so simple and mundane of a thing to name these games after, I can't help but smile just thinking about it. With that said, they agree to wait until morning to look for her father, as at around lunchtime she'd usually take him some food anyway. Before they set out, however, Ryo finds blueprints for the mirrors on a desk in the house. While Shenhua doesn't know much about it, she says that since her dad is a stonemason, that he might. The next morning, things only get weirder as they head to the stone pit. There's a lack of birds in areas where there should be, and Shenhua notices that something feels off. They go into the cave they expect him to be at, and instead find a letter with his handwriting instead. Next to it is a sword, and the letter mentions that his work, whatever that means, is done and that he's leaving the sword to them. He says for Shenhua to go with the one who has the phoenix, and that he'll be the one to find the quote-unquote proof. After they're done reading, they decide to look for what he was referencing in his letter, and before long they find somewhere they can place the sword he left, and things only get weirder as a strange stone pillar comes out of the ground once they put it in. On it looks like an indentation for the Phoenix mirror, and as Ryo places it in there, there's a massive light show which results in a series of ropes and lamps being set on fire. This reveals that in the wall of the cave, what Shenhua's father was carving was 2 large phoenix and dragon mirrors. Shenhua reads off the poem from the beginning of the game one last time, and the game comes to a close. That's where things sat for 18 years, on a cliffhanger which is perfectly designed to have you dying for more. Disc 4 is more like a precursor to Shenmue 3. If it was at the start of Shenmue 3, people would have complained about the long forest sections, so by having it as a sort of reflective, story-light section at the end of Disc 2 is a really nice move. As for the story, it's simple here. Ryo arrives, he needs to get to the village, he meets Shenhua, and then the whole cave thing happens. It keeps you hooked with minimal investment, which is something I can get behind, and I'd argue this is the reason why people wanted Shenmue 3 so much. People wanted to see what happened once they left that cave, and if it was delivered poorly, people wouldn't have cared as much as they did. Of course they did. They definitely did alright. I think at the end of it that Shenmue 2's story is long and complex. It has twists and turns and multiple ways to do things, but ultimately ends at the same destination. It's no surprise that Yu Suzuki and co brought in actual movie screenwriters to make just how it ends up being presented just gorgeous. While Discs 1 and 2 have their strong moments that get dragged down by certain pacing issues, Discs 3 and 4 are home to some of the most iconic scenes in video games ever. The characters I could be here all day talking about. Joy, Ren and Yuan are just a joy to watch whenever they're on screen, whereas the lesser characters like Cool Z, Izumi and Wong still leave a lasting impression in one way or another. Ryo feels more fleshed out here too. On numerous occasions we see that he's far from perfect, and still has a way to go before he can even dream of facing Landy. He keeps his wooden attitude from the first game, sure, but we also get to see him occasionally loosen up a lot more here too, which I think goes a long way making him a much more interesting protagonist. My only gripe with the writing is Disc 4. While I can appreciate what it was going for narrative-wise, a 2-hour buffer between any sort of story events is not a good idea. Being in such stark contrast pacing-wise to the past 10 hours is what makes it unique, but that isn't a wholly positive thing. One compliment I will give though is that there are cutscenes you will miss on a first playthrough depending on which paths you end up taking in the forest, which is something cool at least. In fact, the only real downside is that for a game world as big as Shenmue's, not all locations are utilised in the story. Of course they shouldn't have to, there's a lot of buildings I think should just be optional, but it's a shame that there's areas which 99% of players won't get to visit because the story is so focused on a few key locations. By far the biggest offender of this is Wanchai. There's the Golden Quarter which gets used in the story once, and the rest of the game you're just running through it to get from A to B. Which is a shame because much like the first game, this game is packed with content in every area. Maybe not to the extent that you can inspect everything, but it's still a shame some of it lies there unused. I will say that when it comes to things in the story I think are a stroke of genius, Ren's contribution and the entry into the fighting areas are by far fantastic ways to mitigate the thing I've just mentioned. Both require a large amount of money, one that you're most likely not going to have due to your bag being stolen at the beginning and needing to pay rent. These events also come right before their Disc's point of no return, so taking these opportunities to at least experience some of the content you hadn't already, whether that be buildings, side stories and new ways to make money, I can appreciate what the team was going for here. With that said, I think the good far outweighs the bad here. Shenmue 2's story is done on a much bigger scale than what came before it, and they nailed it. It has a good balance of comedic and serious and downtime moments, and it never feels as though the game is too serious. Ryo may be on a quest for revenge, but that doesn't mean he can't have just a little bit of fun along the way. Now, however long this segment ends up being, I can't do the story justice enough. Play the game to get the full experience, I assure you won't regret it. There's a reason people's reactions to Shenmue's 3 announcement were as over the top as they were, so if you haven't played the game yourself, I highly suggest you do. And who knows, maybe you'll react the exact same way when we end up getting Shenmue 4. Now, I know that was probably quite a long segment for some of you, so for this next one, let's dial it back. I know for most of my other reviews, if you've seen them, I have a tendency to kind of just skip over the story portion if anything, but because Shenmue kind of is a lot more gameplay-like than those ones, I decided to focus a lot more on the story this time, because it's also really good. Anyway, getting into the look of Shenmue 2, I think it's one that still holds up today. Obviously, not in a technical sense, but much like the first game, the effort put into the texturing and everything here is one I think doesn't hinder the experience looking back on it, and it has its own little feel to it. Now, of course, things do have a low poly count, and the actual textures are low resolution, but I think the aesthetic side of things is something that still holds up. Of course, between versions there are minor changes, but they're really nothing much unless you're looking at the remaster, which added a few small but appreciated enhancements like improved lighting. The scope of the places you'll be visiting in this game is widely increased too. While places like Dobuita certainly have a size to them, Shenmue II manages to have a lot more going on in areas much the same, or even larger sizes in some cases. Especially when it comes to certain areas in Wanchai. Cars will be zooming past, the lights will be lighting up, fountains will run at all hours of the day, which, while the standard nowadays, back in 2001, stuff like this wasn't seen at all on a big scale. And all this comes together to make areas that still hold up today. The fountain in Workers' Pier, the lights in Beverly Hill Wharf at night, the neon signs all around Wanchai, and the cosy interiors of Kowloon are all bursting with personality even 2 whole decades later. I can't express how good these areas still look today, and the fact that some of the limitations from the first game are much less noticeable, namely NPCs vanishing on occasion, and you get a world which does really stand the test of time. No matter what version you're playing on, the console will do it justice. Of course, the remaster does have options for optional 4x3, bloom lighting, which you can toggle on and off in the settings, but besides that, it's very much the same game visually in all departments. There's just 2 problems. The first one stemming from the setting itself. Now, while visually impressive, it doesn't hit the same notes that Disc 1 and 2 in Shenmue 1 did, which I think lets it down a bunch. Now, of course, setting this game in a bustling city for most of it is gonna have the impact, but all these areas, especially in Wanchai, just feel as though they're empty above all else. They don't have that cozy feeling that those tight Japan streets had from the first game, and instead just feel empty. And I know that's a weird statement to make, considering these places are packed with NPCs, but, looking at footage of Golden Quarter, I don't feel that feeling like I do with Shenmue 1, which is a damn shame. Honestly, the fact that Shenmue 1 begins just the start of December gives it a lot more options to work with as it gets closer to Christmas, with decorations coming up and the occasional bits of snow. Shenmue 2, on the other hand, starts in the middle of January at the absolute earliest, and really doesn't have any celebrations in the game at all, which would change the atmosphere. Even if it was just a bit of snow, trees changing colour, or something to make the world feel a little bit more dynamic like Shenmue 1, maybe I'd like it more. Especially because of the time you spend in these areas too. This is mainly a complaint filed at Wanchai, but because you by far spend the most time there, by the time you're setting off to Kowloon, you've practically seen all there is to see about 3 times. The other problem, the world is very, very, very big, and I'm namely pointing at Wanchai here. Now, that in itself isn't the problem, but Wanchai suffers so hard in the sense that navigating between the areas of its map is really daunting, especially when it's your first or second run through. As I mentioned at the start of the story section too, the fact of the matter is that unlike Shenmue 1, the world is almost too big in the sense that the story really doesn't allocate enough of these locations, especially the indoor ones, proper time. It's funny, I never thought I'd complain about a game having too much content packed into it, and it honestly doesn't feel like it should be a detriment. But it still is one. Navigating Wanchai, even when you've got the maps, can be an absolute pain. A lot of the areas, while they are connected in a sensical fashion, there's so many of them, and a lot of them are kind of samey looking, you can get lost easily. Couple that with interiors which do get used and not being the best ones in the game, and the ones that are the best not being used at all, and just a generally difficult to navigate map with very little in the way of any indicators as to where anything is, and what you get is a map which, while good in its own respective rights, can be an absolute nightmare to traverse unless you're carrying about 15 different maps. You'll be happy to hear though that almost every problem I have with Wanchai as a game world is fixed in Kowloon once you reach Disc 3. Seriously, you can tell they took the lessons they learned with the first few areas to make these ones a whole lot better. Whether that just be limiting the scope a bit so they could have more story content focused on there, feedback from playtesters, or even just a better selection of places to base the game off of, Kowloon works as a game world so much better than Wanchai ever could. It's not as big, meaning you experience practically all of it, And while there's only ever really 4 main outdoor areas, each one has a huge feel to it, something that Wanchai lacked desperately. The change in scenery from what felt like the heart of China to a place that seriously feels like a place run by gangs is noticeable, and it's a good one. I also feel like I have to mention some of the fighting areas here specifically, because this type of unique area is something the first 2 discs needed. Fighting in what appears to be ancient ruins is something that leaves a huge impression, something that generic Shop Street number 4 doesn't. Of course, Disc 4 is of a similar quality, if not higher too. Again, I think Guilin has had a lot of praise over the year for how nice the scenery looks on the hardware they had, but the outdoor areas look nice. And again, while I'm personally a fan of the series when it's at much more urban areas, it's hard not to concede that this place still looks really nice all these years later. Moving back into the urban areas, where the first part of the game really didn't get much of a reaction out of me, Kowloon with its almost uncomfortably open spaces and skyscrapers that seem to go up and up for miles creates something magical. And much like the first game, these areas feel lived in. At Cafe Ann you can see people stopping for a snack in areas Rio can't reach. You can see these people gathered around the fighting areas, and you can see guards blocking entrances into buildings you're not meant to be in just yet. If anything else, this is the area I'm glad they did the most justice, as the real Kowloon was demolished a few years before the game came out, so in a very strange way, it actually acts like a time capsule of some sorts. Now I know I said the first areas of the game lacked any type of events and variety to shake them up, much like the snow in the first game, and there's no different with Kowloon, as the weather stays pretty much the same. However, there is a distinct feel to each area in the city, something Wanchai wishes it could do. Thousand Whitewater has areas where you're looked down on by skyscrapers to quaint little cafes. Stand Quarter feels alive with its fountain and markets, and Dragon Street has its quaint charm to it. It may not rain in Kowloon, but its areas go the extra mile to compensate for that. Actually, on that note, the weather in this game, for lack of a better term, is pretty disappointing. In Disc 4 it has varied weather which is scripted, but the other 85% of the game it doesn't rain or snow nearly as much as it could, and when that comes, the changes are minimal at least. It's strange, they spent all those resources on weather systems for the first game, and then didn't use them to their fullest here. Again, I reckon they could have taken the weather system from the first game and just slapped it on here, and no one really would have complained. Moments in Shenmue 1 where it was raining are some I'm pretty sure most of you watching will remember quite fondly, and I reckon the same would have happened here. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that, oh, the game's graphics are awful because there isn't enough rain, and when it does it's barely noticeable. I'm not going to say it's exactly a game breaker, but for something like Shenmue where the small details really have to matter because of the type of game it is, it's a shame if nothing else. On a more positive note, one thing drastically improved from the first game was the lighting at night. In the first game, you'd get your 7 PM cutscene and some streetlights would turn on, and maybe a few windows would light up. In Shenmue 2, you'd get a new cutscene for the same purpose, and well, I know it probably helps that there's more buildings per area in this game, but my god, there's one word I can use here, and it's serene. Just yes, yes, yes. This is what people mean when they call Shenmue an experience, because it replicates that feeling of life to a T, especially in the areas shown in the first 3 discs. This isn't a small town anymore. When the sun goes down, things don't just stop. They carry on with a similar level of life, and that's conveyed perfectly here. Of course people are going to have their lights on, but not everyone will, because some people might still be out and about or asleep, and it's just mwah. I do have to now say, it is obvious they put some lights in areas that didn't really make much sense to make it easier to see, but they don't overdo it to a point where it's immersion breaking, and if anything I can appreciate the extra little bit of brightness. When it comes to the day side of the game, again things are much the same, but I think the inclusion of shadows and I think the changing around of a few things they used definitely helps elevate this one above the original. And finally, I have to say this because I found this out literally as I was writing the script, but it turns out that in some rooms the game actually has reflections. Now sadly, the Dreamcast isn't ray tracing enabled. My heart hurts as much as yours does hearing that line. But how they did this is pretty interesting because the technology wasn't there at the time. So say you're seeing a reflection on the floor, they just kind of flipped the room and made the floor transparent. And considering that this really hadn't been done in most games until this point, it's cool to look back and see the tricks they used before the actual technology for doing those was in place. Stuff like that is pretty much sprinkled through all of these games, and I touch a lot more on it in the first review, but again, wrapping up this section, I think the graphics of Shenmue II are still really good. The game world could be improved, and God knows why I decided to write this into the graphics section, but I think again, it still holds up. Whether you like I&II or you find it a little bit of a nuisance like I do, it's a nice time. If you are asking me, Shenmue I's soundtrack is still today one of the best examples for how music can be used to set the tone of a game really well. Made up of 15 free tracks as well as music for cutscenes and buildings, overall it was a pretty small soundtrack. The free tracks especially were designed to fit no matter where you were outside, if you were at the harbour, Dobuita or Yamanose. Shenmue II on the other hand gave every single street in the game its own day and night track, especially for Disc 4, which mostly has one theme for each area due to how the time mechanics there I mentioned earlier. I counted 14 out and about themes in I&II, 8 in Aberdeen, a stunning 16 for Kowloon, and I'm pretty sure there were 11 on Disc 4. I'm not too sure, the OST listing makes it really hard to find what isn't cutscene music. But if you add those together, you end up with about 49 music tracks just for being out and about, which is larger than the entirety of the first game's soundtrack. Add on the unique music for each building and cutscene, and you easily get a soundtrack multiple times bigger than Shenmue I's. Because of the change in approach as to how music was handled, each area now has its own feel to it music-wise. Wise Man's Quarter feels like a bustling street full of shops in the day, but has a much more different, ominous tone after dark. Just up the road you have Manmo Temple, which has a very serene and serious feel for both times of day, and practically every other area in the game is like this. The music just fits so damn well. A lot of the tracks actually make use of traditional Chinese instruments that really help you get into the mood of the whole newer setting. Throwing some musical genius along with that, and the soundtrack has a really unique sound to it. You don't find this type of music in any other games, which makes it all the more special. Don't get me wrong, there are good and bad tracks in the soundtrack, but the fact they still sound like they belong is something to be impressed by. I'd say it's similar to the free tracks from the first game. You'll like a fair few, be relatively indifferent to the rest while you're playing, and you'll have one or two which you don't like all that much. Honestly, the only downside here is that, because of features I'll mention later on, you're most likely going to miss a large portion of the music this game has to offer, which is a real shame. Honestly, ditching this one-size-fits-all feel from the first game really helps here, especially considering that this game is much longer than the first. Bundle that with the fact that almost no music from Discs 1 and 2 appear on Disc 3 and 4, and it keeps everything feeling relatively fresh throughout. I can't do this soundtrack justice. Areas like the Thousand White Quarter don't just look intimidating, but they sound intimidating too. No matter where you are in the game, and I cannot stress this enough, it sounds like the type of music you'd expect to play to accompany it. Small things like melodies repeating in the respective day or night versions of each area's tracks, changes to the tempo and its instrumentals to adjust to the new atmospheres after dark, are so flawlessly executed that it's criminal that the whole soundtrack isn't already on Spotify. Seriously, just have a small listen to some of these tracks. It's not just that though. As you progress through the game, the music gets a lot more serious. If you want to compare Dragon Street Day to something like Workers' Pier Day, both of which the first area you begin their respective discs in, while they're definitely different, they both have a similar atmosphere. However, while Workers' Pier is definitely more of a laid-back vibe in the day, by the time Ryo arrives in Kowloon, he's much closer to his goal and things start to heat up. And the moment you step off the bus, you're hit with... It shows that this disc is where things are going to heat up drastically, because while the music fits just fine, the option to make it the way it ended up being, with a lot of musical stabs and a really consistent bass part, which keeps drumming along, says more than I ever could about the change in story between these two locations. Now, I briefly touched on this in Review 1, but cutscenes in certain areas in the game have their own special music. Think of Tom's Hot Dog Truck or Goro's theme, if you want an example, and they're here in full force too. The game has new music for quick-time events, people performing in the street, fighting enemies, which includes a great rendition of the fighting theme from the first game. Cutscenes have their own score too, which, while not too memorable, much like the first game, they at least enhance the experience, especially some of the themes that play when you're sneaking around with Ren in Kowloon. This actually really helps certain scenes that happen later on, namely when Ryo's looking for Ren in Pigeon Park. Rather than having Workers' Pier Day, which would normally be playing in that area, there's a unique track played there to help fit the atmosphere accordingly, considering that this is one of the last times you're actually going to be there. That is the only time I can think of it off the top of my head, but it does happen a few other times in the game as well. Now, this segment is being added in after the review was almost done, but it turns out, much like the first game, there are jukeboxes in certain areas where you can change the background music for each area or building. And unlike the first game, these are all entirely unique songs, with most being variations of music that were already in the game, but spruced up to be a little bit more lively. Honestly, even while I was writing this review, the game still surprised me with something I hadn't seen before. And in all honesty, from the tracks I've heard from the jukebox in the short time I had to, honestly, I was in the middle of a recording, they're all really well done. And coming out around the OST now, I want to talk about this game's main, notebook and menu themes. Honestly, there isn't any changes to the menu music, I just didn't mention it in the first review, but it's a nice calm before the storm piece of music, which is really nice to listen to. As for the notebook track, in the first game it was a very synth, MIDI heavy version of the main theme, but here it's just flat out an excerpt of it. I'm not sure which I prefer though. I like the original rendition, and I feel as though it fits the setting of the first game a lot better. I think both work just fine, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss the original rendition of it just a tiny bit. And finally, there's the main theme. This piece of music is used a lot, and not in a bad way. Although you will hear the leitmotif a fair bit every so often, it's never too in your face, which is great because you aren't sick of the song by the time the game ends. Something which, if you've seen my New Horizons review, definitely happened over there. And as for the actual piece of music itself, my god, the full orchestra performing this gives me chills, it's perfect. Whether it's the rather empty feeling beginning with nothing but an uru, or all the instruments coming together towards the end, it works. There's a reason why they announced Shenmue III with this piece of music, and it isn't hard to see why. So much of Shenmue music is top quality, and of course I'd do it a disservice if I did anything but play a sample of it now. Seriously, while I've only touched on the very basics, some of the other stuff in this soundtrack is still absolutely phenomenal. But of course, the soundtrack isn't the only piece of audio in this game. It's all voice acted after all. Now, originally, this game wasn't dubbed for English like the first game was. In fact, the only way to play the game without the Japanese audio with subtitles on the Dreamcast is by modifying your discs. If you want the game in English without the hassle, it's either the Xbox or the re-release. I have to say, initially I was hesitant if I wanted to pick up the Dreamcast version because, I'll be honest, going from Rio sounding like I'd grown used to him to a completely new voice actor was initially kinda jarring. But when I thought about it, I eventually settled on the Dreamcast version because it meant I actually got to experience both voice tracks. Both dubs are about the same quality as they were in the first. If you loved the awkward and cheesy delivery of the English one in the first game, boy are you in for a treat. But I will give credit where it's due. While the Japanese dub maintains a higher level of quality and consistency throughout it, the English dub does actually sound improved. The cast sound like they were given proper, or at least improved direction this time, well, at least for the main cast. Joy, Ren, Zhu-Ying and Wong at times definitely have their odd moments, but for the most part they're all quality voice actors. Serious praise to them for pulling off as many lines as they did that well. The remaining characters can vary in quality, but most fall in the spectrum of passable to decent to a few S-tier ones like Dong-Yu and Yuan. Now, if you want your really off-sounding lines, there's plenty to be had here too. And I have to say, it still has its certain charm to it. There's just one problem though. The English dub on the re-release, and at parts on the Xbox, is very poorly mixed, to the point you'll have to audibly squint to hear certain lines. It wasn't originally an issue in the first game, but considering how it was most likely done only after the exclusivity deal was confirmed and Sega saw a benefit to dubbing the game, there's a chance that someone over on the Xbox side of things was left to handle it rather than the people from the first game. As for the Japanese dub, it's better. Now, I actually prefer the delivery of the English track, it has a certain charm to it, but if we're talking about quality, the original voiceover takes home the gold. There's something oddly fitting about Rio moving to a country he's not familiar with, and everyone, rightfully so, speaking a different sounding language. Honestly, the switch from the dub to the sub on the Dreamcast was one I was mostly used by to the end of Disc 1, and was pretty much fully mesmerised by the time the end of Disc 3 rolled around. I think characters like Wong benefited from the fact Japan has voice acting schools, as you can tell someone a lot more experienced is voicing him in this one, as each line is actually a lot more legible to hear. Little things like that, I think, elevate this voice track above the English one, but if you don't care for the admittedly cheesy way the dub handles things and want the higher audio track, the sub is right up your alley. And if you live for the corny delivery of the dub like I do, expect more of the same from the first game, but with some noticeable improvements that will make you smile to hear. But we're not done with the voiceovers yet. I want to give my credit to Censored Gaming for this one, but did you know that Yuan, who appears in discs 2 and 3, is actually a guy? Now, in the original dub track, he obviously sounds like a guy, but when dubbing it for the West, they decided, as to not confuse or offend anyone, they would change it to be a female voice, because 2001 was a different time and people were not very nice.
I've
seen you somewhere.
But where it gets interesting is that the non-Japanese Dreamcast version of the game, which had audio from Japan, God, that was a tongue twister and a half, they hired a new female voice actor to re-record his lines for the same reason I mentioned before. What's strange, however, is that the re-release doesn't include this voice, which seems like a real shame, although I guess there was technical difficulties as to how that'd be incorporated, as its like own audio track. But I thought it was a fun fact nonetheless. If you want my honest opinion on each voice actor, I think the English one does the best job here. They really, really play up how insane the character can be, with both Japanese VAs just trailing behind with more of a focus on the intimidating side of the character, whereas the US one kind of just plays up how crazy they are. There was nowhere else where I could really fit this point, but I thought it'd be worth a mention because again, I find it quite interesting to read about. And I think it goes without saying that, with all that said, Shenmue II is an audio buffet even 20 years later. From the improved direction of the English dub to the quirks of different voice actors, or the absolute gems that are the background and cutscene music, if there's one takeaway from this review you have, it's to at least give the soundtrack a listen. The account on YouTube, Shenmue Fans, has some really good compilations on their channel, which I listened to whilst writing this review, and seriously, I can't state this enough. The range that this soundtrack manages to cover is amazing by today's standards, and even more so than 2001's. Some of the tracks in the OST are criminally underrated, And while strangely enough some rapper decided to jump on the Nightfall track from the first game, I still think they're pretty underrated. So hey, there's one takeaway: the music in this game is really good, and you should definitely give it a listen. Okay, we've managed to get to the 30-minute mark without talking about gameplay. That's one hell of a detour even for me. Okay, so Shenmue II, at least for the vast majority of its runtime, plays much like the original. However, there are changes. Button mapping has been improved. Now the notebook, open door, speaking, pause menu, and newly added finance advice option all have their own buttons mapped to them. On the Dreamcast version, you're given the option to use the joysticks to control Ryo this time round instead of the D-pad, and surprisingly the only thing that remains mostly the same is the fighting system. But before that, let's break down the core gameplay loop in case you didn't watch the first review. In the notebook, Ryo will write down information he learns pertaining to leads he gets from speaking to people. You can then either ask people to gather more info or try and follow up on whatever leads you need to. There's multiple ways to go about one objective too for some encounters, so if you know where to look or just get lucky, it keeps subsequent run-throughs feeling fresh. In the event you have trouble finding a certain area, most wandering NPCs will now either give you simple directions, or in some cases just walk you straight there. And when you consider how big the places are in this game, as I'm sure if you stuck around for the graphics section, I said Wan Chai was really easy to get lost in, it's a welcome addition. When speaking with the citizens of Hong Kong, there's also a lot more variety in the dialogue options too, as now there are menus to discuss different things pertaining to the current story beat, rather than whatever the game thinks is the most relevant. Of course, there is a nice portion of NPCs which won't give you anything useful and will rather talk about something completely different, which is something I wish the first game did more, because I'd love to interact with the world more beyond just asking people for the next step in my story. As I mentioned before and will most likely go into depth later, Ryo can ask NPCs about the various ways to make money nearby, since in this game he's got to have a lot of cash to advance the plot. The main two mechanics I'll touch on are the Lucky Hit stall and moving crates and books, because these are the two activities that the game makes sure you need to complete at least once. When it comes to manning the stall, it's as you would expect. You're given money by the stall owner and you need to play people at Lucky Hit by dropping a marble in the top and, well, getting more hits than losses. If you win, they give you their money, and if you don't, you give them money back. Make a profit and that's your earnings. Now, as for when it comes to moving crates or books, you'll move whatever you're carrying from A to B with a few quick time events mixed in here and there. Fail and you lose some time and subsequently money, succeed and you don't. There are also a bunch of other ways to make money, though those work exactly how you'd expect and all offer their own explanations and are entirely optional, but we'll go into them later. Now, I know that was a little bit of a sidetrack, so getting back to how you'll spend most of your time, you'll obviously be running around. The areas in this game are leagues bigger than those from the first, so to accommodate for this, you can buy optional maps for each area. These will help you figure out just the rough outline of the area, and there are the old map boards, which were used in the first game, dotted around to help go into a few more details, and those are what I personally prefer to use. The maps you can buy, well, they are slightly useful, and they take up an okay portion of the screen, and green and red isn't the most appealing colour combination to look at, but I mean hey, they get the job done. Carrying on, I can kind of understand why locations aren't labelled on them when they're in the corner of your screen, because it would just take up too much space, although you can observe them in greater detail, and you'd expect the typical stuff, it's all there. Besides that, they're pretty much a welcome addition. They may not look the best, certainly, but they at least serve a purpose, so you can't knock them for that. Even walking is improved. You see, in the original you could only control Ryo using the D-pad, which led to some pretty awkward movement, but in this game, on every single console, he can be controlled with a joystick. And having his movement designed with a joystick in mind, rather than only 4 directions, makes for much more fluid and less clunky moments while you're roaming around Hong Kong. Spruced into the gameplay are, as expected from the man who made Virtua Fighter, fighting segments. Here you can kick, punch, dodge and throw your opponents into oblivion. Each button has its own use, and it functions exactly how you'd expect a fighting engine to. If Ryo hits an opponent, they take damage. If they hit Ryo, he takes damage. If anyone dodges, they can either reduce their damage or avoid an oncoming attack altogether. Combos also make a return from the first game. You input multiple buttons at once or in a sequence, and Ryo will do a lot more complex move and will most likely deal a forklift load more damage to his opponent. Another way to deal more damage is to actually just drain Ryo in a variety of different areas. This isn't mandatory, but the more he executes his moves, the more their meter fills up. The higher it goes, the more damage it does, and in some cases, the speed of which they're carried out and the way they look changes as well. Considering on the Dreamcast and re-release you can carry move progress over to the second game, if you want a nice head start, it's a no-brainer. Now, Shenmue II has Ryo fighting with a lot more experienced fighters throughout its plot as well, so the chance of someone dodging or parrying his attacks is much higher in this game too. So unlike the first game, you can't just mash buttons until the fight's over. Certain fighters will have certain styles to keep you on your feet, and certain battles will have QTE segments incorporated into them. These are almost always the new freeze QTEs, which we'll get into later, and they're either used to dodge a powerful attack, or as a cinematic way to end the fight. Other improvements include an enemy health bar on the bottom right hand side of the screen, more moves you can learn throughout the story, and generally feeling as though they made it flow just a little bit better. It's good old Shenmue fighting, not too hard, not too difficult, easy to get the hang of, at least for the main story. Side battles can end up being really difficult if you take the time to go through their levels, so if you want a challenge, there is at least some for you. Now with that covered, and as I just hinted at it, there's the QTE segments, which stands for Quick Time Event. Now even looking back, Shenmue is known as the game series which brought these into at least common use within the industry, and funnily enough, this game helped further that use, because this game easily had the most changes to its formula. The basic ones from the first game are still here. You either press a single or series of button presses as Ryo carries out an action. If you do it successfully, he succeeds in his action, and if he fails, you get treated to a different outcome where he doesn't. If you fail too many, you might have to restart, or you'll just get a different story outcome. And when it comes to it, most of these sequences make sense. If Ryo's going to kick, punch and dodge, usually that button shows up, and as for the direction, it's the same deal, nothing really major. But they decided that for more impactful moments, they needed something a little bit different. And that's where the freeze QTEs come into play. These, as the name would suggest, will freeze whatever is currently going on and require a series of consecutive button presses to be inputted perfectly within what is usually a really short time window. They appear in the Donyu and Izumi fights, they appear when Ren jumps off the scaffolding or tries to knock you out, they practically appear pretty much whenever a regular QTE can't do something justice. The problem is that they are, for lack of a better term, kind of poorly implemented. I agree that there should be a timer on them, but especially in their earlier instances, it is far too quick. Not impossible, but considering it's hard to make out when these are actually going to begin or what the inputs are, it comes out to things which can feel kind of stiff. Now, when it comes to the warehouse event which you can fail and carry on with, that's fine, but the amount of times that these sequences have to be perfect before you can progress past that point can be really infuriating. I know they're coming in most instances, and yet I still manage to fail them. It's bad enough in the Izumi fight where I lose a good bit of my health, but when they're at the end of a long chase sequence or fight and I have to get them right, it can be really annoying when I fail and have to do the whole thing over. And that's the problem, because like every D-pad ever made, the ones you'll be playing this game with like to do the whole 360. Now, you can see why that's a problem, because the game is really strict on if where you're pressing counts. Now, you can get used to these guys, and usually by disc 3 they're tuned to the point where they're not as difficult, and they're actually pretty generous in their timing. But in the beginning, they're a good idea that can be dragged down by a few errors, and that ends up having a huge impact, especially when some of them can lead to content you wouldn't see otherwise. Much like the first game, Shenmue II runs on a 24-hour in-game clock, with each lasting about approximately an hour if you don't encounter anything that might skip the time forward. Certain events are tied to certain times of the day, shops will open and close according to their schedule, and the game world will change in subtle ways throughout the day, most noticeably at 7 PM where a short cutscene will play, the music will change, and a lot more artificial lights turn on. Now, one of the main criticisms of the first game was that you had to wait around for things to happen. In fact, I referenced it in the opening, it's so common. So for this game, if you want to skip right to the time an event is going to happen, you can. And if you don't have to. It appeases both types of fans. You can either keep going through the story as quick as you want, or you can play it like it's Shenmue 1. And much like the first game, there's also a lot of things to do in that downtime if that sounds like your cup of tea, but once again, we'll touch on those later. Seriously though, I can't express how much of a godsend this is. Being able to skip forward in the time is something which, as a content creator myself, is really appreciated, because I can only really center my videos around plot points, and I can only have so many episodes where I'm sat around waiting for something to happen. So for Shenmue 1, where I'd have to walk away and wait 40 minutes before I could carry on with my recording, being able to just skip to the next event without even needing a jump cut is something, at least from my perspective, I can really appreciate. Now, as I'm sure you've noticed, I haven't mentioned how Guilin plays yet, and that's because it isn't like anything that came before it. At the start of Disc 4, Ryo leaves the starting town, and then spends the following hours mostly walking to Bailu Village and talking to Shenhua. There are a few QTE segments every so often, but the majority of the disc is just spent taking in the landscapes. And if this really isn't your cup of tea, I can agree this part can drag on a little big, but you can speedrun this segment of the game down to about 20 to 40 minutes if you just want to see the ending. And it is an appreciated change of pace. There's no fights on the disc, and I think what makes it appealing to so many people, you have these gorgeous landscapes to just walk through, and it gives you time to process the story up until that point. I talked about this in the story portion as well, but this type of thing could only fit at the end of the game. If this was the start of Shenmue 3, there would be riots because it took so long to get fully started. So whether it was ambition getting the better of them yet again, or a stroke of genius that took 19 years to be realised, Disc 4 serves its own purpose as a bit of gameplay surprisingly well. Until it doesn't. Because, as I touched on previously, you can follow NPCs, and, as in the story, Ryo doesn't know where Bailu Village is, he's following Shenhua, which, if you want to take in the scenery, you have to go at the pace the game wants you to go, because realistically, why would Ryo need to run ahead if he doesn't know where the village is? The problem is that Shenhua moves at a snail's pace. In Wanchai, this is fine. I can follow them for a little bit, kind of get on the right track. But this limits you. You can't run past Shenhua, you have to walk right behind her, and the only way to actually speed up the whole segment is to jump to the next area entirely. Which is a problem because this place looks so nice and I want to take in how good things look, but at the same time, I was born in the 2000s and so I have early onset ADHD, which makes me not want to walk at 2 miles per hour behind a girl I've just met. I understand it from a logical perspective, but please, just let Shenhua catch up to me. Why is she so persistent on walking at 2 miles an hour when later in the story she'll be nagging me about we need to get to somewhere before dark? These areas look so nice, and yet I can't explore them at my own pace, but rather a snail's one. With that tangent out of the way, I will wrap up this segment. So, much like the first game, the gameplay isn't the only part of the experience. In terms of other games, it's actually pretty shallow. You know, you run around speaking to people just to progress the plot, but it doesn't need to be that deep. I think how it takes these features and incorporates them is honestly a good attempt if nothing else. Yes, the freeze QTEs can be a pain-inducing feature if you don't know what you're doing, and certain elements simply have aged poorly with time, but as a vehicle to experience the rest of the game, it's a good system. It aged well for the most part, though there is obvious flaws, but as I've yet to play Shenmue 3, all I can hope is that the problems I've had here either don't appear or are at least fixed in some capacity. Shenmue 1 had its fair share of side activities, enough to keep you occupied at the very least. So, what did Shenmue 2 have? Of course the arcade games made a return, either in the arcades or various buildings around Kowloon. It's pretty much the same selection, so if you're thinking your favourite of Space Harrier or Outrun isn't going to be there, then don't worry. Although there are definitely a few changes here and there, namely in the QTE games where they made a sequel and tried to spice things up to accommodate the new features. A change from the first game is that Ryo can now work whenever he wants, as long as there's nothing conflicting with the time when he wants to. He can move crates at the port with Delin, man the lucky hit stall for a few hours, or better yet, waste those wages on even more capsule toys. Pawn shops also exist if you're in need of a quick bit of cash, but if you want to take things slow, why not listen to someone playing what I think is an Uru by the side of the street? Hell, if that isn't entertainment, just down another jet cola. If earning money legitimately isn't your specialty, do the reasonable thing and gamble it all away. How may you ask? Well, on offer there's street fighting, lucky hit, arm wrestling, slot machines, dice games, which all function exactly like how you would suggest them to, but there are instructions for each in case you need a little refresher. Now, I'm only going to go in depth on a few of these things because I think that these are the ones you're most likely going to run into. Starting off, I want to focus on the arm wrestling and street fighting arenas because these by far have the most depth to them. As you complete more rounds, the difficulty increases. This means that your entry bet is higher, but your opponent is also tougher to beat. However, if you win, you get a much larger reward. Normally, what level you're fighting at is displayed in the top corner of the screen, and that's pretty much where it ends for wrestling, but street fighting is a whole other story. See, while arm wrestling can't really have many variations in how it's used, the street fights you can partake in can. They all have their own gimmicks, which is great because you'll almost always find a ring you can get behind. Whether that be not getting caught, fighting with an unusual style, trying to make the person show a reaction, or just trying to catch an acrobat, there's a surprising amount of creativity and thought behind the places you can visit. Now, what if you've done everything I just mentioned? Well, if you want to spice things up, how about you go off to the races in a money sense, so to speak? Well, there's something for you too. All you need to do is speak to these two people in Pigeon Park and the convenience store, go to the come over guest house and commit some light theft in the area nearby, making sure you take this medal on the table. Head into the arcade in Golden Quarter, go up the stairs, proceed to beat the daylights of the two women you spoke to mere moments before, meet Azumi back at the tomato store and she'll take you duck racing. Why is this in the game, you ask? No idea. Does it get worse? Of course it does. Go to the tree in the Manmo Temple and catch 3 leaves in a row or 3 at once, and after that you'll hear a quack and you'll need to catch a duck feather. If you do it successfully, Ryo will then punch the tree and can now enter into the duck races himself, with the duck that's found its way into the tree. Yes, you do actually get to control the duck. So that means while there you can either bet on the other ducks, and if yours comes first of course you win a nice prize, or if you think you're better than all of those other stupid ducks, you can race your own and also make a really tidy profit. It's pretty simple, but it's also just really amusing to be here. If you don't own the games, or maybe you don't have a save up to the Disc 2 portion which lets you do this, you're in luck, because over on Twitch.tv there's a boss account which streams the races 24/7, and you can even like bet in them on the chat on the side if you have a Twitch account. God, I love what this community can do sometimes. And another small fun fact, this is actually how I first learnt about Shenmue. I used to watch a channel called the Easter Egg Hunter at the time his video on the game came out, and that's how I first heard of the game, although obviously things didn't click right away until I realised about a decade later. Of course, just like in the first game, there's events which you can very well miss if you're not in the right place at the right time. They're usually just a short dialogue sequence followed by a quick QTE, and they're charming if nothing else. In addition, there's also a few nods to Shenmue 1 which are quite well hidden. The first one that kind of comes to mind is in the Yanten apartments, you can find the twin brother of Wang Guang who worked in the Chinese restaurant in the first game. If you spoke to him, he'd actually mentioned that his brother was in China or Hong Kong, so to see that small detail actually followed up on here is something I can really get behind. Finally, if you're playing on the Dreamcast or HD collection, you have the option to carry over your save data from the first game. Any progress towards learning moves is moved over, making Ryo much stronger, and he has a much wider range of moves to start with. His money is carried over, although that seems a little trivial, and any story items like Nozomi's photo or capsule toys will also make the jump. What's interesting is that the in-game date does too, to an extent. When Ryo gets on the boat, it will always take him 20-something days until he arrives in Hong Kong, which is either a blessing if you want to take your time, or a curse depending on if you're fearful of bad endings. Talking about those, it's the same rodeo as the first game. Ryo goes to sleep after a certain date, the mirror cracks, and Landy game ends him and Shenhua. It's pretty hard to get, although if you want to experience everything, you might get just a little bit pressed for time. As far as I'm aware, the start time if you don't have a save imported is still more than enough for the main story, and most of the people coming from Shenmue 1 should have an extra month or so if they beat the game pretty quickly. Talking about Shenmue 1, this game has no passport disc. For those who maybe need a refresher, Shenmue Passport was included with every copy of Shenmue and is what contained the wide selection of extras like the ability to watch cutscenes you'd already triggered again, listen to music, see how your high score on the arcade machines ranked up against people all around the world, and even see a few facial expression demos to name a few. Now, the online portion of this disc has since been discontinued, but it's a shame that something like this wasn't made for the second game. Again, in the modern age, you could just look up the OST online, but I think something like this would have been a nice novelty for the time. Although, considering how SEGA was doing at the time, I can understand why they opted to not make one for this game too, as it just would have drummed up development costs more than they already had at that point. With that said, I think it's suffice to say that, yeah, much like the first game, Shenmue II has no lack of activities to keep you busy. If you explore, there's bound to be something for you to do, and I don't think a lot of games can hold that title. Variety helps too. If you don't like one activity, that's okay. There's at least one other that you might prefer. Compare that to Shenmue 1, that only had the choice of what arcade games and capsule machines you could shop at, and Shenmue 2 wins by a landslide in the extra things to do. If that tradition's carried on from the first game, or just seeing something you hadn't before, I'm not the first person to say this, and I sure won't be the last. But every time you play Shenmue 2, the chance that you'll see something new each time, whether that's a hidden area, a rare cutscene, or some music you might have just missed, the game is so big that it makes the first game almost feel insignificant in size, which is no small task. Like I did in the first game's review, I'm gonna have a section here about the changes the remaster made. The only problem is that this game was also ported to the original Xbox, so I'll try and summarise the version differences between them the best I can. Starting with the Dreamcast, it only came out practically in anywhere but America. It only has Japanese audio with subtitles unless you want to mod it, and in regions outside of Japan, Yuan's voice actor was replaced with a female one. It's split across 4 discs, and this is what I've been using to segment the story portion of the review on. Up next is the Xbox version. This added minor graphical changes, the ability to take photos in-game for certain unlockables, and was somehow all managed to be fit onto one disc, and most notably had English dialogue included. Since the first game wasn't on Xbox, this version also came with a DVD recapping the events of the first game called Shenmue the Movie. Finally, there's the remaster which came out in 2018 for PC, Xbox One and PS4. This version includes both dialogue option, although Yuan's female Japanese voice isn't present. Once again, textures have been cleared up, the UI was noticeably fixed up as well, and on the consoles it released they once again managed to fit both games onto a single disc. In Shenmue 2 there's also a digest movie from the first game carried over from the Dreamcast, which is different from the movie that was with the Xbox version. And finally, all versions of Shenmue 2, whether it be Dreamcast, Xbox or HD, let you save anywhere you want, unlike the first game, as you had to run back to the dojo in order to do that. So when it comes to Shenmue 2, this is a really welcome change, as in the first game it wasn't too bothersome until you got to the days you worked at the harbour and were kind of locked there for the whole day. But considering how far you'd have to run to save if this SIP system was kept in place for the second game, being able to save without the hassle is great, especially in places like the Ghost Hall building, or just before major story points. Now it goes without saying that each of these versions has different reasons to play them. The Dreamcast version has problems reading the third disc and wasn't released in the US due to an exclusivity detail, meaning you'll most likely need to import that and a PAL console in order to play the version over there. Of course, being a retro cult classic, it's also really expensive, which would push you to look to the Xbox or remastered version. However, the game also had its original look and feel intact, and came with a nice cardboard sleeve, 2 cases, and a voice for Yuan that you can't hear anywhere else. The Xbox version is cheap if all else, comes with a DVD, and it pretty much runs on every Xbox ever released. And the remaster is just simply more accessible for everyone. However, despite seeming like the most obvious option, it isn't an open and shut case. Cutscenes, for whatever reason, run in this awful looking bordered window in the second game, which ruins some of the best moments. You can mod this out on PC, but if you're on PS4 or Xbox One, good luck. What's worse is that because I patched my game, I wasn't able to import my save, so if you are planning on doing that, just do it beforehand and save yourself the stress. Seriously, could you imagine if most of the footage in the review looks like this? You'd click off in a heartbeat. But yeah, to its credit though, it did also carry over the added features from the Xbox version, and it suffers way less frame rate drops than the other releases. Honestly, the reason I've stuck with the remaster footage for most of this review is it's by far the easiest version to record, although I do want to say that I have played the Dreamcast version as well, at least whenever Disc 3 wanted to not crash, that is. Now, before we start to wrap up this review, I think it's only fair that I do some quick-fire complaints that I couldn't really fit anywhere else. Because, as I've said multiple times, it does hold up well in most aspects, but others definitely didn't age well. So, starting off, the elevators in Kowloon only stop on certain floors, despite the fact they most likely could stop at any floor, considering there'd have to be a lift shaft to get to the floors above the ones they don't stop at. As I've touched on the freeze QTEs before, but god can they be frustrating to get to. At launch, the HD versions had a noticeable amount of bugs which impaired the overall experience, and if you want to try some impairment, try playing Disc 3 on the Dreamcast. It's like Russian roulette over if the game wants to boot up or not most days. When it comes to street fighting, on the first time you interact with each ring after a startup, that regardless of if you've already been there or not, there's an unskippable cutscene. While improved from the first game, audio compression is still noticeable at times, and the gambling system is completely broken, as with the new saving system, you can just reload if you bet it all on black and lose. The camera likes to move at Mach 2 speed when using anything but the automatic one, and the fact you can somehow lose fights you're scripted to lose and then have to restart because you didn't last long enough to lose when the game wanted you to lose is just plain confusing. It goes without saying that this game has its flaws like any other. From some I can see from a programming standpoint as to why they'd be hard to remove or fix, and others I think were genuine steps in the wrong direction that just tripped at the last hurdle. Of course, not all of these are exactly reasonable to understand. I still think the lift system is stupid, but hey, it encourages me to explore. I still think it's insanely stupid that so many people have problems with their Disc 3, whether their ranges were from launch day or newly replaced entirely, is something that 100% should have been found and fixed before release. Shenmue may have been the first of its kind, but that doesn't make it exempt from criticism where it's due. If you saw my New Horizons review, I wrapped it up with a segment where I talked about how everything I discussed in the past 50 minutes came together in the final product. And Shenmue is exactly the type of game I think deserves the same thing. Now, I know I didn't do this for the first review, but that has a section which I'm not going to include in this review, so I'd say they kind of even things out. Now, I think it goes without saying that Shenmue has its distinctive feel to it. Regardless of what game or disc you're playing, that feeling is what Shenmue is. At least for me. That feeling you just can't seem to get anywhere else. Hong Kong feels lived in. But more importantly, it feels authentic. The game feels based on real life, which is what the original intention was. Whether that be use of real-world photographs in some of the texture work, or the fact the team was so faithful in their recreations, even in the areas where I said I didn't feel much earlier, the areas feel as though they're full of life. They may have lost some of the charm the areas in the first game had, you get that with a change in scenery as big as this one, but that core feeling that the game world still gives you remains all the same. Tasks in-game feel like their real-life counterparts would, although they're spiced up just enough to make them at least a little bit more enjoyable than what they are in real life. You might not enjoy moving crates, but I think it's good enough to where you can at least tolerate it, something which is a very, very fine line to tread on. The feeling of always seeming to see new people and recognise the odd face in a crowd is something that games like GTA 5 wish they could replicate as well. The main cast are all really charming to watch interact in either language, and without them the story just wouldn't be the same. And, of course, all the music sounds Chinese. Why wouldn't it? The game takes place in China. Being introduced to all these new instruments I haven't heard before, and seeing them be used in ways of which I wouldn't normally expect, while foreign to me, feels like it's authentic to the place the game is set in. Of course, the way these tracks were arranged isn't to be underestimated either. I was practically foaming at the mouth writing the audio section. In fact, as of writing, I finished all the compilations of the music I could find, and I would rewrite in a few more things, although I have a feeling I might just end up releasing this about the time Shenmue 4 comes out if I end up going loose over there again. Everything is designed in a way that makes you excited to continue onward, first playthrough or 10th. And when you bring the story, the characters, the graphics, the audio, and all the extra content together in one place, Shenmue feels real, but new and exciting and enjoyable at the same time, and it maintains that throughout the whole game. What you get is something special, something that breaks all conventions of games even today, and remakes them into something you'll never see from anyone but the people at SEGA and YSNet. You'll have heard the phrase, Shenmue isn't just a game, it's an experience thrown around, either in this review or around the internet, and if you've interacted with enough Shenmue content, I'm sure you know what they mean. That feeling and thing that Shenmue tries to go for may not be for everyone, but it definitely strikes a chord with those that it does. What I'm trying to put into words as best I can is that it's impossible to nail just what Shenmue is. That feeling and the way everything comes together should be recreatable, but no one's been able to do it. And while, certainly, if someone were able to do it, that'd be great, what they've got here is something special, and it's something you don't see often. In fact, Yu Suzuki has said himself that he doesn't play games. And I think because of that kind of outsider-looking approach is what makes the game so special. From its offset, the way it was designed is something I don't think many other people could have came up with. Any conventions and things that could have changed what was at the core of the game, he didn't know, so what you have is ultimately the purest form of what he set out to make. And let me tell you, is that for someone who doesn't play games all that much, you made a game for practically every second you're playing, it's bliss. Again, I think the outside-looking-in approach is something more people should take a look at. It's definitely good to see the perspective of someone not involved, and kind of distancing yourself from everything you already know allows you to make something that no one sees coming. And I think that's what makes Shenmue so unique, even all this time later. The Shenmue games are games I think anyone who's a fan of the medium should play. This insanely long video can't do it justice, and that's why I want to share the joy, so to speak. Luckily enough for you guys watching the video in the first month it's out, I'll be giving away one copy of the game on PC for Steam. Now, I would have liked to do one for Xbox and PS4 as well, but sadly they aren't as easy to get game keys for. So if you've enjoyed the sound of things so far and don't own the games yourself yet, feel free to leave a comment, no need to subscribe. All I ask is that at the end of your comment you could put -G as seen on screen now, so I know who wants to enter and who doesn't. That would be great. I'll draw the winner randomly in a month after this video goes live, and I'll try my best to respond to your comment and send you your key one way or another. In the meantime, if you're concerned about minimum requirements, I'm pretty sure most computers should be able to handle the minimum settings, although a quick Google search just to be 100% sure would never hurt anyone. If you're wondering how I'm going to get your keys to you, I'll respond to your comment and you'll just, if you reply with your Twitter or something so I can privately message you, I can send you your key. If you don't respond with any of those in a week, I'll just draw another person and I'll keep going until, someone actually responds and gets the key. Best luck to those of you that choose to enter, and hopefully whoever wins enjoys the games as much as I have. What I want to end on is this. How do you make a game this good? How do you take a console that struggled to run the first game at times, and then make a game almost 4 times its scope? How do you manage to make a fanbase that is willing to raise millions at even the thought of a new game, and how do you manage to do all of that with pretty much a perfect quality across the board? This review is, well, the playback bar doesn't lie. I've spent close to the past 2 hours talking about Shenmue II. I've broken down everything, the story, its graphics, voice acting, soundtrack, practically everything about this game that I could come up with, and yet I still don't know why I love it so much. The villains, especially Donyu, can be extremely one-dimensional, and yet they still manage to make each scene they're in an absolute joy to watch. If it's the graphics, the story, or a mix of all there is to do in the game, Shenmue II is a game I have massive respect for. Not just in what it and its predecessors did for gaming as a whole, but also as a genuinely enjoyable piece of media. There is nothing like Shenmue, and there's never going to be anything like it again, unless of course, Yu Suzuki himself decides to create the 4th game. And if the last 2 hours are anything to go by, I think you'll know whether I'll decide to back it or not. This game and its playstyles aren't for everyone, but it doesn't try to be. And what it does go for, it goes for masterfully. Everything about this game, if it be the poor but also decent at times English voice acting which has its charm, the way everything is presented, to the story which gives most blockbusters of today not just a run for their money, but one for their life savings, it represents the peak of gaming from an era long since gone. It wasn't made to make a quick profit, but rather to realise a vision that Yu Suzuki truly believed in, and 20 years later, that passion still shines through. If you've watched this whole thing, which as of writing is totaling out just over 20,000 words, thank you. By this point you're probably wondering what I'm going to rate the game, although I have a feeling if you've made it this far you've got a pretty good idea of what it's going to be. I don't say this blinded by nostalgia, I only found these games going into 2019 because I heard they were games that all Dreamcast owners have to play, and even in the beginning I was actually pretty skeptical if I was going to enjoy them at all. But I stuck with it, through problems I had with my discs, and made it to where the series left off 2 whole decades ago. And I'm so glad I did. Shenmue II isn't for everyone, but it's a beautiful game if you do see what it's trying to do, and I know for sure I'm in the camp that did. It's a slow burn, much like this review, and I don't mind that. And so for me personally, I think it deserves no less than a 9.5 out of 10. For every one bad thing I can think about this game, hardware issues aside, I could find so many good things to balance it out. I did need to be fair, however, there are things which do slightly taint the overall experience, but those don't stop it from still being truly amazing. If you like the sound of these games, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to pick them up. I really think the remasters have done a lot in making the franchise more accessible, and the fact that they managed to go on sale so much is something I think is a criminally good deal. But if it lets people get into the franchise, then so be it. 18 years after the second game released, we finally managed to get the third installment out of the door, and most franchises would be dead in the water if they waited that amount of time for a new installment. But not Shenmue. It managed to cultivate a very passionate and very vocal community because of the quality of these games, and I'm proud to say that in one way or another I've played my own personal part in it. But with that said, I think I'm out of things to say. I'll leave you the outro, which I'm probably going to put in after recording and editing most of this review, but I really do hope you've enjoyed. Again, likes, comments, and, maybe the odd share. I don't really beg for those that much, would be appreciated. But with that said, I hope you've enjoyed. And here we are, it's the outro, but it's basically customary for the end of every review on this channel to have kind of like an afterword, if you will. Now let's get into it. So, first things first. Sheesh. This review is 2 hours long. Over that. Can't really explain why that is. I originally thought this video would turn out to be 90 minutes, and as I put those clips into Vegas, as I recorded the lines, I realised, oh dear, this is not going to be 90 minutes. Seriously though, probably the most fun I've ever had making a review since the Sonic Unleashed one. I let myself take my time with it, which I think it went to a few last minute delays. I'm recording this on the 30th, and I said I'd have it out on the 31st. This thing's probably going to take 18 hours to export, but nah, I'm happy I took my time with this one. I definitely have a problem with I wouldn't say rushing reviews, but cramming a lot of work into a week, whereas this one, it was spread out over the course of 6 months. I think I may have said this in the Let's Play. You can find this more specifically in the Finding Kowloon Let's Play. Again, if you fancy giving the actual Let's Play where all the footage is from, I have that up on my channel in the playlist. But I did specifically mention, starting at the very beginning of Kowloon, that I was writing this review. So I started writing it, and then once it was finished, I was like, right, I'll record this, and then only after I'd finished recording it, I had to wait a few episodes, and then I could actually start editing the video, because I'd have all the footage, which sounds really stupid, but I was that eager to get going. I like Shenmue. We might even do Shenmue 3, maybe. Same kind of deal though. It's still an ongoing series on the channel, so don't expect it for a while. I know I was kind of saying that I could only make this one immediately after the Let's Play finished, which, okay, it's been a few weeks, but I had time for the game to actually sit. The Let's Play was just a rerun, whereas Shenmue 3 is kind of a blind playthrough, so I want to kind of let it sit, right? I think making a review immediately after would... I don't know, I feel as I'd get some stuff wrong if I didn't let it sit, so... I don't know, I might do Shenmue 3, I might not. I definitely think no review's going to get towards this timestamp for a long time. I have this thing in the back of my head. Like, I know I've just said that, but it's like, oh, you did 2 hours, 10 minutes is this going to end up being? I don't have the Vegas project open. It's like, oh, you did 2 hours, 10 minutes last time. Okay, let's make it 2 hours 40, and it keeps trying to one up itself. And I think I should just find a time frame I'm comfortable with and stick with it for once. Originally, this again, I thought it would be 90 minutes, but like as I put the clips that I recorded into Vegas, I was like, oh dear. I think the actual original runtime for all the audio, so the main bulk of the review, not this. This is being recorded after everything is edited. It's at, I think it's sat at 2 hours 20 minutes, and it's down to whatever it is now. It's just under 2 hours, isn't it? Yeah, it's weird. There's a lot of weird stuff that goes into these reviews. Again, I have like the entire series just sat there on the timeline, and the more I go through the review, the more like spliced it gets. It's weird, but if you ever video edit, I'm pretty sure you'll know what I'm on about. I downloaded the videos in a higher quality this time too. I think Shenmue 1's review was just... I'm not sure what happened with some of those clips, and I'm sorry. You know, I'm always fearful of that one clip which downloads wrong and ruins the render, but I think we're out of the woods for this one. Again, Shenmue 1's review, it's a good review, but there was so much more stuff went wrong with that one. A half-an-hour video than this one ever did. Like, I was downloading the footage, right, and there was the episode where I go to the tattoo parlor, nothing much happens, except the fact I go to the tattoo parlor, which was like one of my biggest complaints against the game, which I have accidentally erased from existence. I don't know where. I may have deleted the raw recording, I don't think I'd have deleted it after it was uploaded, but it might have been after it exported. I deleted it, didn't realise, and I'd saved my game, so I couldn't go back and record it, and it was a gut punch, but, you know, at least we have all the footage this time. It was like the Shenmue 1 Let's Play, like, I enjoyed it, but it was cursed. You know, we didn't have the widescreen mod this time, which is, if you're wondering why the footage looks, you know, so crisp and tasty, why there was pop-in stuff, I was using that mod for all this gameplay footage, in case you missed that portion. It was a fun review and Let's Play to make, but I'd be damned if stuff didn't go wrong. Speaking of things that go wrong, though, you know, like I said, nothing's really gone wrong with this review. Vegas Pro, like, for the first one, because I had so much stuff on the timeline, it would, like, freeze up and whatnot. Like, guaranteed this one's going to take 18 hours to export, but, you know, it's generally been more par for the course, despite the length. I think this might be my magnum opus of a review. I dare say. Yep, I say that. And you know, I'll one-up it in 2 months, guarantee. With that said, getting towards the end, I'm glad the other reviews are getting recognition. I said this at the end of the New Horizons review, I think? Well, the Sonic Unleashed review did well. That was stuck at 10 views for a few days after it was uploaded. And it was kind of a disappointment, but I was like, okay, you know, the watch time was really high. And I come back, and it's like nearing 1,000 views now, which is crazy. I can only hope the same thing happens for this one, if not more. Like, again, my end goal for this video was, A, say how much I love Shenmue 2 for in an excess of 2 hours, and B, try and get some new people interested in the game. If I'm actually lucky enough to get picked up by the algorithm for this, because, I mean, if YouTube sees a 2-hour-long video, people watching its entirety, like, I think they're going to throw that in some people's recommended. I do want to get some more people interested in the game. I think there's a Shenmue anime coming out. I well and truly believe Shenmue 4 is going to come out. Hashtag Let's Get Shenmue 4 on the 4th of each month. You know I'm there. I want to get people interested. I think the more people that play these games and the more vocal the community is and the better they sell, it's good for the franchise. I want to see it succeed, and if this is my way of contributing, then so be it. With that said, if you have made it all the way through, please don't subscribe off this one video. That might sound really dumb. Feel free to like and comment, but this isn't the content I normally make. I make Let's Play videos, so I get the footage from the Let's Play, and then I might make a review from it. Yeah, I do not make reviews frequently, so, you know, check out the other stuff, and if you enjoy that, then maybe subscribe. Again, I have the entire Shenmue II playlist It's all on my public playlist bar. It's not that hard to find. Go check that out, or any of my other stuff too. I'm running out of Shenmue content to do, so if you find another series you like as well, it's it's a little bit of a benefit. But seriously, I cannot stress this enough. Don't subscribe expecting reviews, because this one took like 6 months to make, with having to wait for the Let's Play to finish, writing, recording it. It took a while. With that said though, I should probably get this one exporting. Again, I have a feeling it's going to take like close to, if not a day to export, because there's so many tracks, there's so many things, it's so long, and I'm using Vegas Pro, it's a perfect storm to take that long. I'm still trying to meet that March 31st deadline, and I can only hope. I'm not going to premiere this one too, I think I'll just upload it flat out. This time around I spoke much more slower than I did in previous reviews. I know I've sped up now, but a lot of my previous reviews, people would complain I spoke too fast. So now, I purposely spoke a little slower than average, so if people found it too slow, they could speed it up. And YouTube doesn't mask the audio when you speed it up, but it does when you slow it down, and it was better for everyone, because hey, you play the review faster. In no way did I speak slower to get the review over 2 hours. I just want to say that. And I think that's everything I've got. I have a little notes thing down, and I think that's everything. So if you have enjoyed, be sure to, leave a like and a comment, and maybe check out the other content. I have a whole reviews playlist up, so if you want to see my review of Animal Crossing New Horizons or Sonic Unleashed, both of which are over an hour long, feel free. And with that said, and all that aside, I think I'm going to end this one here. I think this video is long enough, so thank you if you've made it this far. I will and truly appreciate it. Feel free to share it around too. I know I don't say that much, but hey, I am interested in getting some feedback on stuff which could be improved with these things. Again, I have a different perspective than some people, so I kind of want to see people agree, disagree, and the more people that watch this one, the more funky feedback I can get. And yeah, all that aside, this has been a project that took literally between 5 and 6 months to finish. And it feels really weird to say that I'm finishing it. But yeah, here we are. And with all that aside, this feels very surreal. Thanks for watching, guys. My name's been Neremik, and peace out. Right, I knew this was going to happen, but I didn't expect it to happen within the hour of me finishing the final edit of the review. So, I was listening to some Shenmue music, right? And I come across a song called Barry Jones, and I thought, well, I don't really remember any relevant characters of the plot names and that, so I do a little digging. And it turns out the darts minigame, I kind of skipped over it, but it's basically darts. Turns out that isn't just playable in the arcade, but pubs, which, is fine. I'd expect a dartboard to be in there. But it turns out you can actually play people for money on the dartboard. I've owned this game for 2 years, I've made a 2-hour-long review on said game, and I'm still finding new stuff. How was this game made for Dreamcast? This man, this team of people, SEGA, how? It's genuinely, I have a feeling that in 2050 someone is going to discover just yet another Shenmue Easter egg. They discover 5 new things about this game per year. I didn't think I'd actually be able to get this on video. I've literally just finished finding all this out. But just how? How is there so much stuff people haven't found? And then when you find it, it's how did I miss this? He was stood right there. And it's... Okay, I know this probably seems really out of place, and I'm speaking way much faster because the review was recorded 2 months ago, besides the outro, but just how? Why? Why is... I'm not going to complain that there's a dartboard and extra stuff to do, but just the fact that there's so much stuff to do, which I skipped over, and it links back to the part where not all the areas get used. I wish I knew about this. The music is so funky, and it's just... Jeez, this game is something else. The more and more. Nobody care yourself fast. Everybody now about to say. Man, the death is out. Your mission. So we have to